Now, Klein is often cited as saying, love is not just admiration for strength, it is also tolerance for weakness.
Babies are schizophrenic, conservatives have baby brain, equals conservatives are schizophrenic, paranoid schizophrenics, in the way that they analyze and contend with their love-hate relationship with others. That's my takeaway. All right, why Americans hate each other now.
Okay, guys, confession time. Well, I think of myself as a pretty moral person. You know, I've studied ethics for a lot of my life. I once did something that was truly horrible. I ghosted someone. Now, things with this person had been going great. You know, we had a lot in common. They were really nice, and most importantly, she said it was cute that I was going bald on our first date.
I see you.
This ain't no, oh, I see you.
But then after seeing her a few times, something really horrible happened. I was watching college basketball, and then she turned off my TV and then turned on some form of pop punk music on her iPhone and said, let's just listen to music instead. And at that moment, it was over for me. I had lost that loving feeling. And I imagine in the recent weeks, some of us might have been tempted to do some ghosting of our own. Because in the wake of a really contentious election, a lot of people seem unable to deal with the fact that folks who they liked, that they thought were good, then voted for someone whose overall vibe rhymes with smashist. And it's not just happening with personal relationships, as folks have been blaming entire populations for their complicity in Trump's election. Posts like this are going viral, implying that people in Flint, Michigan deserve lead in their water because their county turned up red on an electoral map. Which leads me to ask, like, what is going on here? You know, how can people disown their family members and wish ecological harm on entire cities? You know, ghost environmental lawyers who like bald guys. These situations all treat reality like a simple matrix of good or bad, moral or immoral, future wife or eternal enemy. And ideally, we would see that reality is more complex or nuanced than these black and white reactions.
You could put half of Trump supporters into what I call the basket.
And that we can't separate voting patterns from underlying economic and social conditions, or, you know, realize that liking Hot Topic music doesn't make you unworthy of love. Okay, so today we're gonna try to understand all of this via the psychoanalytic concept of the paranoid schizoid position. And I think if we understand the psychoanalytic concept, not only will we better understand our own minds, but it can help us understand what's going on societally when we're all falling into this sort of black and white thinking, and even help us understand how we can avoid it. But before we get into it, I wanna give a shout out to this video sponsor, Private Internet Access. Now, Private Internet Access is a VPN. In case you don't know what that is, I'll tell you. So whenever you're browsing online, your device is transmitting a ton of information which can be viewed by hackers or anyone looking to make money off of your personal data. Now, a VPN, a virtual private network, helps you keep your data secure while you're browsing. Think about it this way, right? You wouldn't go to the beach without
Yes, it's sped up.
putting on sunscreen because you know you'd get burned. And in this case, having a VPN is like a bunch of SPF that protects your data and internet activity. And I'm a huge fan of VPNs, not just for safety, but for fun stuff too. Like, did you know that Netflix has different things in different countries? Sometimes shows
I'm doing ethical reacts, chat. Shut up.
we don't get here, but with private internet access, I can just
Also subscribe to the broadcast. I retain the right to serve ads in the future if I feel like it. And you can avoid those future ads and be able to send me links and use emotes and support the broadcast.
just go on a global journey and tell the internet I'm in a bunch of different places and see what sort of cool shows and movies pop up. And even better, private internet access is not just for your computer. It's available on a ton of different devices and on all platforms, including Windows, Mac OS, Linux, Android, and iOS. And there's right? You wouldn't go to the beach without putting on sunscreen, as double internet is protect them for $80 a month. Stay safe when you're on the internet and check out private internet access today. But for now, let's get back to the show. Okay, so let's start with an example to understand this, right? Imagine you just had a fight with your best friend because they said something like, you know, the Grateful Dead is noodly crap music for hippies who smell like dumpsters outside of a dispensary. At first, you might be incensed at their sheer stupidity, but after you have a second to chill out, you realize that, you know, you don't really like their preferred music either. Techno that sounds like how bad drugs feel. And honestly, who cares? Because they're a fiercely loyal,
there ain't no way he's talking shit about Fred again.
That's deeply
crazy.
empathetic friend.
Go back, Sam! I'm going to Mordor alone!
Of course you are, and I'm coming with you!
So, you know, if they don't want to listen to old Dead shows with you on road trips, who cares? They're still your friend. Congratulations. By going on that journey, you've just traveled through the paranoid schizoid vortex and reached the depressive position. Who among us hasn't been in the depressive position recently? For me, it's sort of curled up like that, but still holding a bottle of beer. Now, these terms aren't really about schizophrenia or depression. They're how psychoanalyst Melanie Klein describes a process in human psychology, where we move from black and white ways of thinking to more integrated ways of thinking, one where two things can be true at once. Now, in the former, your initial anger and disgust towards your friend's ignorance about without, jam bands could lead to dramatic conclusions.
Be gone, vile man! Be gone from me!
Like you deciding your friend is unworthy of your company. But in the depressive position, you're able to consider both yourself and your friend as separate, whole people who have mixes of both lovable and hateable qualities. One hateable quality I have is I hate sharing dishes at restaurants. When you go out to dinner and someone's like, ooh, do you want to get this and I'll get that and we'll just share it? I'm like, no. Okay, so once you go through this, your focus turns to repairing the rupture and then deepening your love and understanding
Woke
for
Sky, thank you
your
for the
friend
5
and potentially
gifted.
yourself. It's a process that helps us
Christian
better
821,
access
thank you for the
depths
10
of our own
gifted.
humanity. And incidentally, a process that's seeming increasingly rare, at least over here in the good old United States of America.
He's a war hero because he was captured. I like people that weren't captured, okay? I hate to tell you.
Now, we all experience the transition from paranoid schizoid to depressive position, some more than others. But it's not like after you reach that depressive position, you're set for life. It's a cycle that repeats. We often return to the paranoid schizoid position in response to threats or moments of stress. But if we stay there too long, it leads us to major black and white thinking, which doesn't really do much to honor anyone's complexity or the complexity of the world around us. So, how did Klein develop this theory in the first place? Well, in the early 20th century, she was working with young children, and she observed that to cope with the trauma of being born, as well as early confusing and painful experiences of existing in the world, children defend themselves via something called splitting. Shout out for anyone else who heard the phrase, the trauma of being born, and just stopped and was like, oh shit, man, that's some real stuff right there. Now, in this process, parts of themselves and others become perceived as either all good or all bad, because babies struggle to comprehend how someone could, have horrible taste in music and still be a good person. And this leads them to separate loving feelings from aggressive feelings.
Aggression is just part of human nature. Basically, human beings have loving feelings and aggressive feelings.
And this schizoid instinct encourages us to put a lot of effort into separating good from bad and love from hated. For example, babies experience hunger, but they don't really understand what hunger is or where that's coming from. All they know is that they're in pain and this sucks. But then you give them some milk and they feel better. So they associate the breast or the bottle with goodness. And now the world is fundamentally okay. But of course, babies also have really bad experiences, because the breast is not a vending machine and it might not instantly produce the milk necessary to cure their hunger. When this happens, it can terrify a baby, leading them to see the breast as cruel, terrible, and all bad for withholding. So basically when you think about it, babies are all kind of incels at a certain point. This rage might lead the baby to bite the breast, attacking it because they feel punished, or maybe it might make them just deny the milk as a way of rejecting their dependence on it.
So there's kind of a psychological sleight of hand in which people manage to see aggression in other people, but not in themselves. That gets to what we call the paranoid schizoid position.
Now, as the baby grows, they ideally experience enough positivity and goodness to start to build a central core on which to begin to integrate the contrasting aspects of the self. And in psychoanalytic terms, this is called forming a good internal object. But if there haven't been enough good or loving experiences, then they'll continue to see everyone through the lens of extremes, potential sources of their persecution like the breast. They'll struggle to integrate their experiences into a whole. They'll experience everyone and everything is out to get them unless they get them first.
Try it.
Now, there you have the paranoid piece. And when you put this all together, you get the paranoid schizoid. Along this developmental trajectory, if the person builds that good internal object, they are likely to reach the depressive position. And I know that reaching a depressive position probably doesn't sound like a good thing, but this is actually the state where complexity and individuation prevail, where goodness and badness exist in everyone and everything, the self included. For example, as the baby gets older, they may realize that the caregiver behind the breast or bottle has a lot of other things to do. Sure, they're supposed to feed and nourish you, and hopefully you can count on them to do so, but they won't always come at the exact moment that you desire food. And you start to see them as a mix between good and bad. You start to reconcile your hate with your love. You feel guilty for the times you bit them or refused them, and you seek to repair. You ponder your dependence. You face your annihilation anxiety and start to grow up and figure out ways to feed yourself and others. You learn to feel real love. Now, Klein is often cited as saying, love is not just admiration for strength, it is also tolerance for weakness.
Babies are schizophrenic. Conservatives have baby brain equals conservatives are schizophrenic, paranoid schizophrenics in the way that they analyze and contend with their love-hate relationship with others. That's my takeaway.
Both in others and in the self. But again, it's not like anyone ever overcomes the paranoid schizoid phase and graduates into a rather, Klein saw these positions as transient states of mind. The paranoid schizoid, for instance, defends against the depressive, and especially in times of stress, can even be useful. If someone's trying to break into your house with a big knife, do you want to be in the depressive state and be like, well, technically, the person breaking into my house with a knife, they may have gone through some stuff in their childhood that led them to this position, and boom, you're stabbed. If you were in another position, you would just be like, holy shit, knife guy all bad, me all good, going to live by. However, it can also signify a moment of regression or stunted state of development. In other words, when life gets really stressful and scary, we all start thinking like babies. Even though we're talking about a psychological phenomenon, The paranoid schizoid process has direct social effects, and many have applied Klein's framework to better understand American history and culture. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning, when the land that we now call the Americas was discovered by colonists. And at the time, it was also already very much occupied by human beings. But the colonizers, right, they constructed a narrative about this new world. This new, amazing, all good place good Europeans could go to start a fresh and glorious life. And any threat to their idealized narrative, such as the presence of native people, threatened their story, and therefore had to be all bad. It of course helped that they had God on their side to convince them that they were the good ones. To uphold this tenuous narrative, they employed a paranoid schizoid position to rationalize their domination and annihilation of native people in their land. Now, human beings have a conscience, and thus we have the capacity to feel guilty for harming others in the environment. But the paranoid schizoid position is super good at staving off that guilt. And it's good at finding reasons and systems to rationalize unconscionable behavior. That's how we get things like white supremacy and homophobia, the free market, you name it. We see paranoid schizoid metaphors in contemporary politics when it comes to stuff like the border wall and immigration. Now here the focus is on maintaining a narrative of natural Americans as being all good and migrants as being so they're not even human.
Build that wall. Build that wall. Build that wall. Build that wall.
Any nuance disappears. Like, say, considering that actually the US government has aided and abetted dictatorships, genocides, and the massive extraction of natural resources in many of those migrants' countries of origins, thus making life there increasingly untenable. No, we don't have time for that.
Bro, who are you? Check logs. Hey, Sammy, I'm the one the server's made for. What server? Check DMs on Insta and Patreon. What are you saying, dude? What is going on today?
Sort of thinking.
But let me be clear. Contrary to allegations against Israel made by the International Court of Justice, what's happening is not genocide.
And this all exemplifies the paranoid schizoid split between good guys and bad guys. And our media, history, and social systems are just filled with this way of thinking. That there are simply...
Bro, I literally get like 10 million DMs a day. How the would I be able to find a DM that you sent me at 11 a.m.? It's crazy.
Good and bad people. Like, it's an inherent quality. I'll be honest, I struggled with this so much.
You get one guy
I've been
easily,
politically
that's true, I
idealistic
do.
for most of my life, and when I started to get idealistic, I struggled with thinking like everyone who believes the good stuff is good and anyone else is bad, and it's just not a really productive way to live. Now, while anyone is capable of doing something good or bad, it doesn't mean they're bad or good at a fundamental level. Like a murderer could hold a door open for you, and doesn't make them fundamentally good. Okay, so consider the carceral system. Imagine that someone gets charged with a crime, right? They steal a TV and they get sent to jail. A paranoid schizoid stance would immediately punish this person and color them as all bad, deserving of punishment. It doesn't consider outside influences, and in doing so, it defends against a depressive position, which would interrogate what conditions might have led someone to do a bad thing.
So you were always like this?
Now, a depressive position would look at the context that led the accused to this point, such as poverty. And this is how we start to justify extremes like the death penalty. By prioritizing punishment over empathy, self-reflection, and rehabilitation, people in power use paranoid schizoid thinking to justify the status quo.
But there's no evidence. A video came out of a migrant 30 miles away eating a cat.
Now, many historians have actually traced the death penalty back to lynchings and the enslavement of black people. And it's not a coincidence that the group brought here and enslaved against their will is most likely to be identified as all bad and deserving of annihilation. It's easier to think that you're a good Christian slave owner when you come up with a narrative in which the enslaved person isn't really a person. Dehumanizing your perceived enemy is a highly effective way of staving off guilt for your wrongdoing or that of your ancestors. So psychoanalysts have actually linked racism to the paranoid schizoid position. A 2021 article by psychoanalyst Ebony Dennis applies the paranoid schizoid position to white supremacy and draws a parallel between the baby's annihilation anxiety and dependence on the mother and the colonial white self's annihilation anxiety and dependence on the black slave other. She postulates that whiteness was created in order to distance white people from the racialized other, thereby holding whiteness as all good and then sort of staving off guilt for oppressing the all bad object.
No, I'm not saying white people aren't evil either, because I know we're evil. I got that evil in me.
And to be clear, the object here is just a person, just a human being. But of course, while white people exploited and enslaved black people, they were also dependent on them for providing free labor. They needed them to work rather than, escape or rebel. And so enslaving people then staved off their fears of not being able to survive in an unfamiliar land. So even in a story of dominator and enslaved, in which we don't see a lot of interdependence, there was still an incredible amount of dependency. One dominated the other to stave off fears of being dominated, either by the other or by environmental conditions. And Dennis argues that these dynamics persist today through intergenerational transmission, such that if the oppressed doesn't fulfill the needs of the oppressor, be they physical or psychological, the oppressor continues to oppress in order to restore psychological equilibrium and maintain the status quo. If you guys want to know more about this, I recommend the work of Frantz Fanon. We've talked about him in a few recent videos. He's a philosopher and psychiatrist that really gets at the psychology of colonization and how it affects both the colonizer and the colonized subject. His book, Black Skin, White Masks, is really good on this, so do check out Fanon if you have not already. Now, Dennis argues that paradoxically, this process also oppresses the oppressor. Quote, the intoxicating influence of whiteness creates a vapid space in which thinking is impeded, defended against. Such defense structures obscure the ability to accurately perceive reality, and up until recently have stifled curiosity about the psychological impact of slavery on whites. And this split between good and bad also produces a split in the self, where weak and needy parts are unintegrated, and strength is hollowly celebrated, coalescing in a vulnerable egoism. I mean, to think about this in more contemporary dudish terms, it's sort of like being strong and is good and having emotions is bad, you know? Being an alpha is good and being a little beta is bad. That sort of stuff. And these stories of superiority not only continue to oppress the racialized other, but also unfairly pressure white men and people in general to attempt to fulfill this perceived legacy of dominance and superiority in all areas, and can lead to feelings of inferiority if they do not. I feel like this explains a lot of the weird stuff in the manosphere and areas of this website, where men have some pretty weird ideas. I don't know what the opposite of a shout out is, but opposite shout out Andrew Tate, big opposite ups to Andrew Tate. And this split hurts everyone in different ways because it is not truly reflective of the human condition, which again, as Klein would say, is a mix of weakness and strength, love and hate, goodness and badness. Sounds just like me. If the paranoid schizoid position can be used to understand how some very bad stuff like racism, colonialism, and political divisions are upheld, well, then, you know, maybe we can use it to understand our own lives, and maybe that'll help us to solve some of our biggest societal problems. And we've said this before, but let me just emphasize again, it's not that we're trying to avoid this, right? The paranoid schizoid position at the level of our individual development is unavoidable. You know, we don't have to be ashamed of it. It emerges to help us grapple with scary and unfamiliar things. But it's not our final destination. It's a process that we work through. And we can even see the paranoid schizoid position as an invitation to arrive at the more integrated depressive position. And because this is all happening internally, we're not necessarily cursed to repeat these psychological patterns at the social and political level. So in that sense, what I'm saying is the position isn't all bad, right? It is a natural thing at one level, but it can become a very bad thing when projected outwards onto others. And again, we need it to avoid complete overwhelm.
You know, in the face of like mortality and you're gonna lose people and financial struggles and all of these things that are so unknown, to have some security, you know, I think probably is very seductive.
In moments of stress and anger, we look for security and certainty. You know, sometimes we do need a concrete yes or no, and we can worry about moving on to the depressive position later.
We all subscribe to some kind of narrative of what makes sense in the world. Maybe there is no sense in the world. We all have to either create it or be nihilistic.
So this thinking can offer security so long as we can eventually interrogate it and think about where it's coming from. Here's what my buddy Frank Yeoman has to say.
It's extremely comforting to think we're the good ones, the others are the bad. I think the challenge to society is one of education. How can we educate people to not shy away from complexity? How can we educate people to embrace it and appreciate it rather than be threatened by it?
And this, of course, all plays back into the political tensions that folks are feeling right here in post-election America, where various demographics are just being thrown under the bus for being the bad guys who ruined it for the good guys. And here, I think one final comment from Yeoman will be helpful.
The trick is to have that fervent energy and not totally vilify the other, to be able to maintain some empathy with the other, to understand the other's position, because once it's all vilification, the dialogue breaks down.
So guys, not to be too corny, but it really does feel like we're in a time where empathy and curiosity and dialogue are gonna be a lot more useful than whatever else it is we've been trying. And if we can access those feelings by just embracing a weird part of our own psychology, then hey, to me, that seems like a good thing. Now, in the meantime, don't stay in the depressive state for too long, and please let me know what you think in the comments, especially if you have stories about times that you ghosted or were ghosted. A special shout out to all of our patrons. Your support means a lot. There's a link in the description to check that out. Please subscribe and like and ring the bell if you have not already. It helps us out a ton. And in the meantime, remember that cursing an entire county of people to drink water that's poisoned with lead just because you don't like who a majority of them voted for makes you bad. All the way bad. Sorry, that's one exception to the rule.
I agree. Let me tell you what I also agree on, though.